Okay, so the point of this video is to talk about the Federal Reserve and the money supply and kind of how those two go together. And just to do a brief overview, or not too brief, but an overview of the Federal Reserve and the money supply. And then in the next video, we'll get into the actual mechanics of how all of these things right here, the open market operations, the reserve requirement, and the discount rate actually directly affect the money supply and through that aggregate demand. So to start off our overview, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act, and it has a dual mandate, which means that it has two jobs to do. And this is common in many central banks throughout the world, although it's not the uniform mandate of all of them. So some of them are a little bit different, but this is the most common one. Is to promote the goal of maximum employment, so to keep employment up, and then also to have stable prices and moderate long-term interest rates. So these two kind of go together, stable prices and moderate long-term interest rates. And then maximum employment is the other one. So this is, we'll call this mandate number 1, and this will be mandate number 2. And you can see, if you kind of start thinking about our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, how these two can conflict. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. So what are the tools that the Fed has to do this, to both create maximum employment and stable prices and moderate long-term interest rates? So it can do this by manipulating the money supply. And it has 3 different ways to manipulate the money supply. It can use open market operations, which is either buying or selling securities, financial assets, in the open market. And traditionally this has only been U.S. government debt, but that isn't necessarily the case now. By controlling the reserve requirement, which is how many dollars a bank must keep in reserves, how many dollars it has to keep in its vaults, you can think of it, for each dollar of deposits that it holds. So this, I'm going to do just a little bit more about the reserve requirement, and it gets abbreviated RR. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, which is what it is in the US right now, if the reserve requirement is 10%, and so I put $100 of my money in the bank. The bank has to keep, I put $100 in the bank. Then the bank has to keep, the bank must keep $10 in its vault, because that's 10% of 100. Must keep $10 in its vault. And we'll see how that works out in the next video, how that actually affects the money supply. And then also by controlling the discount rate. And the discount rate is the rate that the Fed charges other banks on loans from the Fed to that commercial bank. So the Fed doesn't lend money to people like me or you. The Fed lends money to banks, and then banks lend money to people like me or you. But the Fed decides what it charges a bank to lend money to me or you. And so if the Fed says, well, you know what, we're going to charge the bank 10%, then the bank says, well, you know what, we're probably going to have to charge person A or person B more than 10% because we have to make a little bit of a profit. And so we'll see how that plays out more in the next video also. So then I want to just give you a little bit more background about how the Fed actually works. So the decision-making body for the Fed is called the Federal Open Market Committee. And they decide what monetary policy will be, which is really what the Fed will do. So they decide on these 3 things, and on how much the Fed is going to change any of these things, what they're going to do. They decide all of that. And so it's a pretty powerful body, and you hear about it a lot in the news and the media, so I want to give you a little more background. So it's composed of the 7 members of the Board of Governors. So there are 7 members of the Board of Governors that sit on the FOMC. And then 5 of the 12 presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks rotate in for a total of 12 members in the Federal Open Market Committee. So there are 7 members of the Board of Governors, which are always there. So I'll go down a little bit more. So there are, and we'll change colors up. So there are 7 people in DC. So these are the 7 Board of Governors. And they are in DC, Washington, D.C., and they're always in D.C., and they're always on the FOMC, always on FOMC. And then the Federal Reserve is, their main headquarters are in DC, but then they have these 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. So the Federal Reserve works like this. There's DC is up here, and then there's 12, and I'm not going to write out 12, but these are all the regional banks. And so the regional banks are in charge of regulating all of the other banks, all of the regular commercial banks in their region. So 5 of those 12 presidents fly to DC every, I don't know what it is. They fly to DC for every single open market committee meeting, and they vote also. So the next thing is that the member of the Board of Governors are nominated by the President of the USA, and then they're confirmed by the Senate. So they're nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. And then each member, once nominated and confirmed, serves for 14 years. And they can't be removed for their political views. So this is pretty big. It gives the Fed a lot of separation from politics. And the reason that we want that separation is that we don't want politicians controlling our money supply. And that's a whole nother story that we'll get into a little bit in the next video. So the last thing that I wanted to say is that the Fed lends to banks. The Fed is like the bank of banks. And by controlling how much it lends to banks, it controls how much the banks lend to you, to the public. So that is all that I want to say about the Fed. You'll hear about it a lot in the news, and it really is an important system to understand. And in the next video, we'll get down to how changing all of these factors right here, how manipulating these factors actually does change the money supply.